Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Angela Rachidi, and I am the Rowe Scholar in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the future for paid leave policy. So as is typical, whenever we plan these events, there has been a lot of action at the federal level since we first conceptualized this discussion, with some action just this week, actually, and we are definitely going to get to that. But I also want to discuss more broadly kind of what we have learned from the pandemic and how it influences paid leave policy. So I am delighted to have with me a tremendous panel of friends and colleagues who all have their own expertise in broad issues around economics and also paid leave. And so I'm going to first do some introductions of our panel, and I'm going to follow that with a brief presentation of some survey data that we have, and then we will follow that with a discussion. So first we have Abby McCloskey. Abby is the principal and founder of McCloskey Policy, where she studies and analyzes various family and economic policies. She is a former AEI scholar and has advised several presidential campaigns. So thank you, Abby, so much for being with us today. We also have Vicki Shabo with us. She is a senior fellow in paid leave policy for New America. She is one of the nation's leading policy experts on paid leave. So any of you who follow this issue closely, I'm sure have seen and benefited greatly from Vicki's work. Previously, she led the National Partnership for Women and Families Workplace Initiatives. So thanks, Vicki, for being with us. And last but not least, we have our own Scott Winship. Scott is the Director of Poverty Studies at AEI, where he studies social mobility and policies to reduce poverty. Scott previously, among other prestigious positions, most recently, he served as the Executive Director for the Joint Economic Committee, where he spearheaded the Social Capital Project. So Scott, it's great to have you with us as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a great discussion about paid leave policy during the pandemic as well as beyond, so into the future. I am going to start with a presentation, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, just to review some findings from a survey that we conducted over the past year on various issues related to employment and other policies, but we had a section on paid leave that offers some interesting information about paid leave availability and use during the pandemic. And I think offers some concrete information, but also raises some implications for the future of paid leave policy. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to jump right into the discussion. So I do have a few slides. So Peyton, if you could bring those up. I wanted to just start with kind of what we mean when we say paid leave. And I'm sure many of you watching are familiar with paid family and medical leave policy. And others of you maybe have heard the term but aren't fully clear on what it means. So when we talk about paid leave, we generally cover kind of 4 areas, really. First is sick leave, so leave from work for an illness. And we generally think of sick leave as kind of short-term leave for being ill. We also talk about parental leave, which is leave from work for the birth or adoption of a child. Family care leave generally means leave from work to care for an ill family member. And I think we most common think of that in terms of elder care or care for a disabled family member. And then finally, we have medical leave, which generally refers to kind of longer term leave for one's own illness that is the need for leave is longer than sick leave. And so for the most part, when we think about policies, they kind of cover those areas. And so in the US, leave policies are generally left to employers. Employers develop their own policies and provide leave to their employees. But there's been quite a bit of discussion recently, and some states have moved toward this to have a policy that is implemented by the government. So that's kind of framing our discussion for today. So in terms of our survey, we, as I mentioned, our survey was of working age adults. We conducted 2 waves. The first wave was in July, so shortly, kind of in the early months after the pandemic. And we asked respondents, we had 3,500 working age adults who responded to the survey. We asked them about access to paid leave as well as use of leave, whether it was paid or unpaid. Then we recontacted those respondents in February and surveyed them again, asking about their more recent access and use of leave. And so what that offers us is a picture of the early months after the pandemic around this issue, as well as how that changed over time. So this first chart gets to that initial question of access to paid leave. And as we can see from this chart, there was an increase in working age adults reporting that they had access to paid leave through their employers. We looked at this question 2 ways. One was among adults who reported having employment leading up to the time of the survey. So these are different individuals that respond or that were working in the July survey versus the February survey, but all had employment leading up to that survey. And then the second group is I wanted to get a sense of those who had a strong connection to the labor market. And so a second group was adults who had employment at the time of both surveys. So these would be individuals, these would be the same individuals at both times. And no matter what 2 groups we looked at, we found a fairly or a large increase or a increase in availability of paid leave through their employer, slightly larger for those who had that stronger connection to employment. And by February 2021, almost 70% of those who were employed at both times said that they had access to paid leave through their employers. And again, that's any type of paid leave for any of those reasons that I discussed. Next slide. We did, though, see that access to paid leave differed by income level. Unsurprisingly, those workers who came from a lower income household had less access to paid leave, and those from higher income households reported more access. And the changes from the time before the pandemic to the February wave were similar across household income level, maybe slight increase over time for those workers in higher income households. Next slide. So then after we asked about access to paid leave, we asked about actual use of paid leave, and we asked use of paid leave by particular type. So this shows the 3 most common types of paid leave, or types of leave, sorry. So this is leave, whether it's paid or not, the 3 most common types. And the first bar in each category, so own illness, child care, or leave to care for an ill family member, is the July survey, and the second bar is February. So what you can see, especially for own illness, leave for own illness, and leave for childcare among parents, was a fairly large increase in use of leave from July to February. And I think that's largely, again, unsurprising given that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and clearly there was a large need to take time off for public health related reasons. And then given the closures and difficulties with childcare, closures of schools and childcare facilities, a need to care for children at home. The colored components of each bar represent whether the leave that people took was paid, partially paid, or unpaid. And so the blue bar shows fully paid. So we can see across all 3 categories, actually, most of the leave was fully paid, but not all of it. Next slide. And this shows the same chart, but for those adults that I talked about that were employed at both times of the survey. Same pattern here, but we see slightly more leave taken among this group that is employed at both times. And again, unsurprising given that this would be a group that is more connected to the labor market, or more consistently connected to the labor market. But overall, the picture that these results show is a fairly large increase in leave taken from July to February. Next slide. So we also asked about any leave taken in the household, just to get a sense, and any leave among anyone in the household, just to get a sense of the overall leave taking at the household and person level. And again, we see large increases from the July survey to the February survey. And I think what is notable from these charts is at the household level, the February survey among those who were employed at both times, almost 40% indicated that someone in the household had taken leave from work. And again, this is leave for any reason. So it could include own illness, it could include childcare. Next slide. So another issue we were really interested in and wanted to capture through the survey was the unmet need for leave. So we first learned that there was a large increase from July to February in leave taking, but we also then, in asking about unmet need, is found an increase in unmet need for leave as well. And so this chart reflects that in July, among both of those groups I talked about, those that had employment leading up to both surveys and those who were employed at both times of the survey, in July, around 20% indicated or reported that they needed to take leave but did not. By February, that increased to almost 30% for those two groups. And the two different colors in the bars reflect those who took some leave, but still, the blue bar is those who took some leave, but still reported that they had an unmet need. So that was slightly less common in July, but by February, almost half of those who reported an unmet need for leave did take some kind of leave. So that to me suggests that they either didn't have enough leave or wanted to save their leave, or some other reason that they still had an unmet need for leave, even though they did take some. Next slide. Then we also looked at this by income level and found that there was a higher reported unmet need for leave among workers in low-income households. Again, not all that surprising. But then the increase from July to February seemed slightly higher for those in the higher income households. But still, those workers in lower income households still reported the highest rate of unmet need for leave. Next slide. Then kind of finally, we asked for the reasons for not taking leave. And the most common reason was could not afford the loss of income as the reason for not taking leave. And if you look at the third down, it's a fear of job loss or negative action. So I kind of think of those as things that are related to paid leave policy. But then the reasons were not all related to lack of access. For example, as you can see, the second most common reason was too much work. And I think what was notable to me is that the reasons people gave did shift a little bit over time. And that was true for the group that had employment leading up to the survey, as well as those who were employed at both times. By February, too much work was a little bit more common than it was in July as the reason for not taking leave, although could not afford the loss of income was still among the most common, and the fear of job loss or negative action also remained relatively common. Next slide. Okay, so those are our results. So I want to bring in Abby, Vicki, and Scott. I mean, overall, and I think some of these findings really aren't surprising given that we were in the middle of a pandemic, but the availability of paid leave certainly increased. It likely was the result of we had some policies early on in the pandemic from the federal government to expand access to paid leave. And then we also have some surveys from the private sector, surveys of the private sector that they had indicated they responded to the pandemic by changing their leave policies, and that really showed up in the survey data. And then we also saw increase in use of leave, again, unsurprising, but then at the same time, a fairly large increase in unmet need, and it was still pretty sizable. About 1/3 of our respondents indicated that they had an unmet need for leave. So bringing in Abby, Vicki, and Scott, I guess I have a few kind of guiding questions. I think the first one is just given kind of the context of what I just presented, as well as kind of what we heard this week in terms of proposals, both from President Biden and from House Democrats, just kind of give me a sense of like what your thoughts are, your reflections on the paid leave landscape right now. And Abby, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, thanks so much, Angela, and for spearheading these surveys. I know I've learned so much from them, and also for bringing us all together to talk about paid leave today. Two general comments. First, about the emergency paid leave provisions, and then second, about the likelihood of a permanent policy and what Biden put out. With respect to the temporary emergency paid leave provisions, I think your work shows, in case there was any doubt, how important it was for Congress to pass the emergency paid leave provisions, and that they did so on a bipartisan basis. You can't have a pandemic environment where less than half of low-wage workers have access to a single paid sick day, and less than 1 in 5 workers have access to paid family leave. So it was really important. But the most important thing, I think, from your surveys, in my opinion, was that 30% who reported still having an unmet need for leave, which is a huge hole in what should have been a pretty robust safety net program. And, I think loss of income being a leading reason is encouraging, because that can be fixed by a higher wage replacement level. Fear of negative action from an employer, I think, is harder and more concerning. And I hope that in these coming months, the government or nonprofits engage in studies to understand better why that's the case, how the reimbursement process worked for employers, so that we can do better the next time around. God forbid there is one, but if there is, that we know how to have a better system in place. With respect to the permanent paid leave program, which I do think of very differently from our temporary program, I'm thrilled that Biden put out a plan. I think there's been considerable momentum for all of us who've looked at this issue for a long time. There's been considerable bipartisan momentum building for the last 5 years or so. This is actually an area that Republicans and Democrats in our crazy polarized environment can come together on. And so with respect to that, I do hope that Republicans can engage in the specifics of the plan instead of stonewalling it as not part of infrastructure, that we can kind of move beyond the semantics and engage in the specifics. And for President Biden and Democrats, we don't know a lot about the details of his proposal, but what he did roll out looks very similar to the Family Act, which has kind of been the leading progressive policy for the last decade that hasn't had any bipartisan support. And so I'm hoping there's flexibility on that side too, because it's such an important issue to solve, that we can come together with a policy that builds on some of the momentum that we've done, Angela, as part of the AI Brookings Working Group, and that so many others in Congress and elsewhere have worked on as well.
Great, thank you, Abby. Great points. Vicki, maybe to you, just your thoughts, reflections, not only on what I presented, although I'm curious about that, but also just kind of what you're very plugged into kind of the policy at the federal level. So just what you see going on.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be part of this panel. This has been a historic week for paid leave, to have both the House Ways and Means Committee chairman roll out a comprehensive paid family and medical leave proposal, coming on the heels of a 4.5-hour hearing that he held last week with women and business owners that have been affected by the pandemic with respect to paid leave and childcare and other ways that the economy failed to support women through this pandemic. I mean, look, we've just been through a year of unprecedented loss of human life, loss of jobs, loss of income, and women and people of color and lower wage workers have borne the brunt of that. And you can see in your data the ways in which paid leave sort of maps onto the challenges, or lack of paid leave maps onto the challenges that some folks have faced. So I think, it feels impossible to think about coming through this pandemic without doing something. I was excited to see the conclusion at the end of the survey report, kind of acknowledging that there is a role for government here. Abby's right. There has been growing momentum in recognition that we can't continue with the status quo. It's costly. It means a loss of GDP, a loss of workforce participation, reduced earnings, reduced retirement security, and a lot of that has disproportionately fallen on women. And now we need to get women back to work. And so, I'm really hopeful. There's a lot about politics that's broken right now, and a lot about policy that's been broken for a long time. And I'm excited to see the president put forward a vision about the kind of investments that need to be made in families, which really are investments in jobs, job creation, enabling other people to have jobs, keeping people attached to the workforce and succeeding and improving and growing over time, and contributing to the economy. And I think the last thing I'll say is, the Ways and Means hearing, the experience with the Families First, emergency protections, and the state experience on paid family and medical leave, which we now have many, many years of data on from a growing number of states, this all shows that this is both a business policy, a policy that supports small businesses in particular, and a policy that supports workers. And together, those two things support the economy. And so I'm thrilled to have two new proposals that are out there that build on the Family Act and that build on the state experience.
Great, thank you. So Scott, there have been some proposals from Republicans in the past around paid leave, but I would say in general, we haven't seen large support among Republicans. So I'm kind of curious, your views just on paid leave landscape in general. And then also kind of a follow-up to that is, has anything during the pandemic changed your views or influenced your views in any way?
Well, thank you, Angela. It's a privilege to be on this panel with you all. I'm less expert on the issue, I think, than all of you. Angela mostly invited me for my well-known disregard of families and children, which I'm glad to bring to this panel. No, in all seriousness, I think, first of all, I would agree with Abby and Vicki in terms of the importance of the policies that we enacted during the pandemic. I think there are any number of policies that in a normal year I probably wouldn't have supported, and probably a lot of conservatives wouldn't have. But I think there's a real success story in terms of policy to deal with the pandemic and our expansions of the safety net generally from last year. That's actually like fairly unappreciated, I think. Moving forward, I get more nervous, I think, about some of the proposals that are being discussed in the same way that I get nervous about a lot of the family policy that's being discussed these days. It's really a confluence, I think, of some progressives who've had a lot of these goals for a long time, combined with more conservatives who are pronatalist. They're worried about the number of kids that we have, about fertility falling. A lot of conservatives, social conservatives in particular, want to help more families that would prefer to be one worker, one parent at home. And so it really is experiencing a moment right now. But I think we risk losing some conservative insights if we move too fast on some of these things. So if I just make 3 points very quickly, I think we do need to take very seriously the cost to employers of some of our policies. Those are obviously very direct costs for proposals that suggest that they should pay more in payroll taxes. But even when there aren't, when employers don't directly pay for it, the loss of losing employees for up to 12 weeks is a pretty big deal to employers, especially small businesses. I always think of, I had a friend growing up who started a convenience store in my hometown. And during the 90s, when the Clinton healthcare reform debates were happening, she was very opposed to the conversations happening, because she basically told me she'd have to close up her convenience store if she were mandated to do some of this stuff. So I think that's got to be an important concern. I think the impact on wages is something to be worried about. If employers respond by lowering wages because they have higher costs, that's something that we need to take seriously. And I think we need to take seriously, too, whether there could be unintended consequences for women in terms of their rates of being hired. This is obviously not something that I'm endorsing, that employers might discriminate in that way. But I think there's some evidence, you all know better than me, that women do tend, it seems like they have worse career outcomes in some regards in places that have a lot of generous paid leave policy. The other area I think we need to be worried about is just federal budget deficits. We deficit financed about $4 trillion of spending last year, over and above what we normally would have. The American Rescue Plan added an additional $1.8 trillion over the next 10 years. The American Families Plan would add another $300 billion over 10 years to the deficit. And that's a real concern. CBO is projecting unheard of levels of debt to GDP. And so we really do need to be careful. And then finally, the one last thing I'd say is that I think we need to keep in mind limiting principles when we think about family policy generally. To what extent don't we believe that people who can afford to absorb the costs of the choices that they make, to what extent, should they not be expected to do that? I tend to view a lot of these conversations as potentially subsidizing a lot of middle class and upper middle class families who we really ought to, I think, continue to hold the expectation that they bear the costs of their choices, their emergencies, health issues that can instigate a need for paid leave, of course, that you can't necessarily anticipate. But for other things, I think we want to be careful about subsidizing decisions around how many kids to have and when, and absolving parents from absorbing some of those costs.
Great, thank you. So Scott, you had mentioned kind of the pandemic and the crisis that was the pandemic and the responsiveness of the emergency measures. So I kind of want to throw that question out to the group in terms of, obviously the pandemic was a crisis. Hopefully it will be once in a lifetime. But even if not, it likely we won't see this type of a crisis on an ongoing basis, at least hopefully. So I guess my question to the group, and maybe we'll go right back to Scott, is should we be using the experience of the pandemic to be guiding long-term policy like this? Because it does seem like the pandemic is often brought up as a justification for the need for these very, I mean, not only on paid leave, but paid leave in particular for these very large, very expensive programs. So do you think that is appropriate? And if not, I guess, what would you recommend in trying to push back on some of that?
Yeah, I've heard this a number of times over the last year that we really should design a safety net, for instance, such that it is ready to be there for when something like a pandemic hits. And I think I just fundamentally disagree with that. The pandemic was a once in a century event. I suspect it will not be another century before, unfortunately, we have another public health crisis that we'll have to deal with. But regardless, it's a rare event. And I think the idea that the rarer an event is, the more we ought to orient our policies around taking even that kind of a rare event into account is just not the right way to think about things. We're never going to have a perfect safety net. We should design it to be adequate and generous enough and sufficient during normal times. But unusual times call for unusual policy, for temporary policy. And so I think the fact that we were successfully able to enact some temporary policies last year when the moment called for it was a sign that ought to be how we ought to do things in the future as well.
Yeah. And Abby, maybe same question to you, and then Vicki, I'll go to you for reaction.
Yeah, I agree with what Scott said. And Angela, you and I wrote a piece at the very beginning of this saying how important it was to keep them separately, which is not to say we can't learn things from what happened in the last year. Like, how did the reimbursement process to employers work? How did people know about the paid leave provisions? But I do think it's separate, and the research around the impacts of a long-term or permanent paid leave policy have really stayed the same. And so to push back ever so gently on what Scott said previously, I do think we know that there's economic benefits that accrue to women in particular from modest paid leave provisions, and that employers in general have been relatively supportive, including small employers in states that have passed these paid family leave policies, that it hasn't been overly burdensome. And so again, there's a large body of research which we have had, which has been growing in the last decade in particular, and we should lean on that when we're thinking about how to craft our permanent policy.
Yep. And Vicki, how has the pandemic shaped your thinking on this?
I mean, to me, the pandemic really underscored a lot of what we in the paid leave movement have been talking about for a long time and added to it. So, even before the pandemic, as we talked about at the beginning, Congress had been making progress, had been looking seriously at paid leave. And that's because 1 in 4 new moms go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. It's because women and men who are 50 or older who drop out of the workforce to care for an aging parent are losing $300,000 or more on average in income and retirement savings. Families are losing $2.5 billion a year in lost wages. Those are resources that are not in the economy. Those are people who are not in jobs. That depresses GDP. It depresses labor force participation. And so this was a problem that we needed to solve well before the pandemic. And the pandemic really underscored the vulnerable positions that workers are in when they don't have access to paid leave. I do think that it was really noteworthy that Congress passed those temporary emergency provisions, but they only applied to about half of the workforce and didn't apply to the people who were in big box stores and grocery stores and warehouses and some health workers in larger institutions and some not even in smaller institutions. And this just underscores that we can't have a patchwork approach. We need to have some baselines. And we need to ensure that people are able to take care of themselves and their loved ones, certainly in a big emergency like a pandemic, but also in those everyday emergencies that people have been facing for a long time at the risk of losing their jobs or losing their wages. And just to respond quickly, if I can, to the kind of points that Scott made, he said he was worried about these things, and I'd love to be able to just quickly maybe allay some of those concerns. So on the small business piece, there are I appreciate your friend's story about healthcare. But I think, we've seen before the pandemic in states that have passed paid leave policies at the federal level, multiple small business owners come forward to testify about how helpful it would be to them to have a policy in place, a program in place, so that they don't have to either absorb the cost of of an employee's absence. There's a fantastic small business owner in Minneapolis who has talked really passionately about how she herself couldn't pay her mortgage because she wanted to pay her employee when that employee broke both arms. And there are lots of stories like that. Molly Moon Neitzel from Seattle testified last week about the importance of Washington State's program. The second is there's no evidence from states that wages have gone down as these paid leave programs have ramped up. Third, women's employment in some countries with really long paid leave policies, we see negative effects, but with one study exception here in the US, the data is pretty consistent that women's employment stays the same or increases, that wages go up over time. And on the deficit point, I mean, one way to finance this is through payroll taxes. That's how the states have done it. It's how the Family Act would do it. I think we have to really think about what we're already absorbing in terms of the cost of a program the cost of the absence of a program, anytime we talk about what it would cost to fill these gaps. So I know I probably have a fundamentally different view of the role of government than Scott does, but I just think, we have seen that the private sector has not solved this problem. Access to paid family leave from employers has doubled in the past 10 years, but it's doubled from 10% to 20% of employers that designate paid family leave. We haven't seen any growth at all in access to short-term disability insurance. And the disparities that exist between low-wage workers and high-wage workers, between those in service jobs and other jobs, they're dramatic, and we are all bearing the cost of those policies right now.
Great. Just as a real quick follow-up to that, so there was a survey, and you may be aware of the survey or not, but it was, Jane Woldfogle was part of the research team, but in New York, and they surveyed establishments, and they surveyed them over 3 years, I believe. And the first year, there was fairly, I would say, strong support among the establishments that they surveyed, and they compared them actually to Pennsylvania establishments to try to get a comparable group. Fairly strong support for the paid leave policies that New York implemented, but it did seem to erode over time. And so you wonder if businesses, once they start experiencing the policies, if some of that initial support and the benefits that they expect from it starts to erode. Just to Scott's point about kind of keeping in mind the burden on employees. But that brings me to another question, which is the different types of leave, and should we have different policies for the different types of leave? So, and would that allow policymakers to address the needs of businesses more holistically? And I'm mostly thinking about, so the Family Act covers parental leave, family care leave, and medical leave. And what President Biden proposed covers those three, but then a separate provision is mandating employers to provide sick leave. So maybe, Abby, I'll start with you because I know you and I have had this conversation in the past, but just about what are your thoughts on packaging these types of leave all together in one policy versus kind of separating them out? And are there advantages and disadvantages to doing either of those?
Thanks. First, a comment on the New York study. It's been a little bit since I've looked at it, but I do believe the majority of establishments still supported the program, but New York is scaling up the amount of leave it's providing, right, over time. And an important caveat to what Vicki mentioned is in our surveys, especially in California, where they've been most robust about the public paid leave programs, they've been for a relatively limited period of time. The new state programs that are longer, 12 weeks or more, we don't have a lot of data on how establishments have responded. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And in that regard, the kind of 12-week Family Act is a bit outside of our research base. But in terms of packaging them all together, when you talk about paid leave and the US being an international outlier and looking, across to Europe about their policies, it's rarely mentioned that nowhere in Europe are all these types of leave bundled together. They went into place at different times, but there's not been any attempt to reconcile them in any comprehensive way into one package. That's very unique here because of the FMLA, which is now 3 decades old. And I would push back on us needing to consider them all and bundle them together as the same, because of course it's very different whether you're recovering from cancer or had a newborn or have a parent with dementia or a terminally ill child. I mean, all these things are very difficult to fit into a one-size-fits-all policy. I believe paid parental leave is an easier lift in that regard. There obviously many people have different experiences with childbirth and becoming a new parent, but it's easier to craft a universal and a rather generous policy. And in fact, that's where the most generous policies are overseas. I think we have to be really careful with trying to have a one-size policy that also encompasses all of medical and family leave. I just think that that's out of step with what we see overseas. And it's also a bit out of step from what our research base is, which is mostly on parental leave at this point.
Yep. And I'm going to build on that question and pose this to you, Scott. And this is kind of a question that came in from the audience as well. But so I share, Scott, some of your concerns about the burden that would be placed on businesses. And we also know that many businesses already provide paid leave to their workers. And so I guess kind of considering both of those things in the context of what we know about unmet need for leave and how I think I agree that we don't want sick people going to work because they can't afford to not work. So how do we marry those two problems? And is there a way to design a policy where you're not crowding out private business and you're not overburdening private businesses, but you're still filling in some of those gaps for people who don't have access to leave?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I can think of two different dimensions that are worth distinguishing. The first dimension, I guess, would be things that are unpredictable risks to workers versus things that are entirely predictable. People do get pregnant and have children when they weren't expecting it or intending to. But in general, the need for family leave upon having a child is something that is much more predictable than, say, coming down with a condition that requires you to be out of the workforce because you're sick or disabled, or because you've lost a loved one, or any number of other sort of unpredictable things. So it could be worth distinguishing between those two different things. Unpredictable events really call for insurance. Predictable events, I think, call more for subsidies or encouraging people to save. The other dimension that I think is worth thinking about, and probably will be controversial, I'm guessing, is employer protection versus versus funding for the leave. You can imagine a paid leave policy that was very generous in terms of giving people replacement rates that allowed them to stay out of work for a specific amount of time, but that weren't paired with the employment protection. And so in that case, as an employee, you're kind of taking a risk, that you're going to leave and not have a job waiting for you when you come back. So that might be another dimension worth thinking about too, that you could play around with each of those dimensions and have different types of policies.
No, that's a really good point, actually, about the job protection. And maybe, Vicki, I'll ask you this, because I do want to get into kind of the Biden proposal a little bit more. How did they address job protection in their proposal, if you know, or if they did? Because, I mean, maybe explain to the audience, too, about FMLA and how that does leave off job protection for some workers.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I want to come back to the New York study really quickly, too.
Okay, yeah.
So much to say. Yeah, so the Medical Leave Act of 1993, which is now, as you said, coming up on 3 decades old, guarantees job protection to workers who are in businesses or establishments with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius of their same company, have been on the job for at least a year and have worked 1,250 hours in the past year. Pre-COVID, that meant that 56% of workers were covered. And those who were disproportionately left out were lower skilled, lower income, workers of color, and single parents. So the very people that are sort of least likely to be in workplaces that provide paid leave or provide unpaid protections voluntarily are those who aren't covered, the very same people who probably can't afford to lose a job or who would face longer unemployment if they did lose a job are less likely to be covered. I'm really worried in the wake of COVID, with so many people having left jobs or been furloughed or laid off their hours, actually how that affects job protection. And so as Congress thinks about paid leave, it's also really important for them to think about expanding FMLA protections. One of the things we know from state programs not expanded job protection to coincide with paid leave is that lower wage workers are less likely to take the leave, in part because they're more likely to be in jobs that don't offer them job protection or where their statutory protections aren't in place. And that in the states, that's problematic because that means that some workers are paying into a system that they don't feel comfortable using. Obviously, as we get into a conversation about different funding mechanisms, potentially at the federal level, maybe that becomes less of a concern, but the access question is very, very real. And so, you know, job protection that coincides with a paid leave benefit is very important.
And so how,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just, how either the House proposal or the Biden proposal, did they touch on job protection at all? I guess I don't remember reading about that at all.
They don't at the moment. That's because they're thinking about income supports. But I think the job protection piece it's something that's come up repeatedly in hearings that Congress has held, and it's a critically important piece of establishing both a paid and job protected policy.
And then you said you had a comment on the New York.
Yeah, just on the New York thing. So it's a great study that just came out. Abby's right. New York ramped up much in the same way, actually, that the Biden proposal is thinking about ramping up. Slightly differently, the duration of leave has ramped up from 8 weeks to 12 weeks in New York over a 4-year period. The wage replacement has ramped up from, I think, 50% to 66%. So the study was happening as, you know, some of these ramp ups were happening. That said, yeah, Abby's correct. Support remains among, you know, over a majority of businesses. The opposition ticked up slightly, but it ticked up from like 4% to 9%. And it wasn't clear whether those businesses even had any experience with workers taking leave. The other thing to know about the New York system is that it actually is more complicated in some ways than other states, in that a large percentage of employers look on the private market for insurance products rather than the default being the public fund. So New York has a public fund as an option, a public option essentially, the state insurance fund, but a lot of employers are also looking on the private market and being solicited by insurance companies to buy their products, which I think adds complexity, particularly for small employers where the marketplace is complicated and potentially more expensive, especially on the TDI side, which doesn't have any price controls. And the other thing I would say is the employer response in New York is consistent with what the employer response has been in California and New Jersey and Rhode Island. So this isn't an aberration with respect to the more than majority support.
Yeah, okay. And Scott, any thoughts on that? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts to what Abby and Vicki said about the employer perspective.
I don't know. I mean, I will say, and I'll confess again that I am the least informed about this on this panel. But the idea that there's a lot of not even latent, but sort of very explicit employer support for paid family leave, and a lot of support among employees. If that's true, then I guess I just wonder why it's been so difficult to get paid leave implemented as a policy. I'm skeptical that it's easy to cite sort of people who are asked selectively to testify before Congress to offer support for some policy, and who are more than happy to do it because that's something that they feel strongly about. But there must be polling, I would assume, on sort of more generally employers and kind of how they view paid leave and the potential burdens that it would impose on them.
Yeah, I mean, the small business surveys that have been done over years have shown 2/3 support, at least among businesses with fewer than 100 employees. And even surveys conducted by like payroll companies have shown at least majority support among larger employers too. So yeah, I think this is one of those issues that among voters, it's popular across party lines, even when you attach a pay for to it. It's popular with businesses that are surveyed scientifically and not, convenient sample or anything like that. I think it's about ideology.
So it's essentially just about ideologically conservative voters who, even though in the quiet of a public opinion survey will express support for the idea of paid leave, when it comes down to whether they want their representative to vote for it or not, they'll argue against their self-interest. In my opinion, I think this is a disconnect between what voters want and what elected representatives are willing to do on the Republican side.
And I would just add too, though, this comes into play in lots of things. You still have a share of businesses and people who do not support the policy. So I think when you have policymakers who are hearing from constituents and business owners who are saying this is going to hurt my business, I could go out of business, even though they're a minority, I think that still has an impact on policymakers. So I want to, first I want to say, anybody in our audience who has questions, we did have a couple come through, but I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question, please email Peyton. The email is here at the bottom of the screen, pwroth97@gmail.com, or feel free to use the Twitter hashtag AEI Family Policy. We have a couple of those coming in of questions, and I've kind of tried to weave them in a little bit. I want to talk, though, I want to shift a little bit to the financing issue, because Scott brought this up earlier about concerns about deficits, debt, all the various family policies that have been proposed by the Biden administration. And how are we going to, as a country, afford all of these policies? The financing details on the Biden plan, the American Families Plan, were pretty thin related to the paid leave policy. And it does seem like there is a need to identify kind of a long-term revenue stream for a policy as ambitious as they put forward. So maybe, Vicki, just your thoughts on kind of what they put out, as well as the House, and what do you think it could be a long-term strategy for a policy like this to actually be properly funded so that it could be sustainable?
Yeah, great question. So the Biden plan proposed $225 billion over 10 years for their program. The Neal bill doesn't have a score. The Family Act does have a score. It's $547 billion because it ramps up the 12 weeks right away, which personally I would support. The Biden financing is caught up in broader tax reform and tax fairness. And so, I think personally, I have long sort of advocated for the minor payroll contribution schemes that have happened, that are the way that paid leave has been financed sustainably and without deficits and without, large increases in the payroll taxes, which are less than 1% of payroll. That's capped even in most states, and in some states it's well below that. So that is one financing scheme. I think there's other ways to do it. The tax redistribution approaches that the administration is using to ensure that corporations and wealthy individuals are paying more of their fair share works too. But I think the real question with cost is, what are we already absorbing that we don't see? And that's true for families. It's true for the country. It's true for businesses. It's true in what we've lost, and also what's actually being put out in other public programs that people turn to sometimes as well. So yeah, I think financing is a real question, but we can do this. We have other programs that are costlier. Arguably, this program would literally, a comprehensive paid family medical leave program would literally touch every household in America at some point when they need it most. So I think this is an important question. I think we know from states the things that might cause the program to have trouble haven't happened in any other scenario that we've seen in the US.
And Abby, your thoughts on the financing? I mean, I know President Biden has said he doesn't want to raise taxes on any households under 400,000, but do you think that that's a realistic thing when thinking about paid leave?
Well, we know that, indirectly from corporate tax, hiking corporate tax rates, that might not hold as just a general promise. Right. But, obviously now is not the time to raise payroll taxes. And that has been the key financing mechanism, which obviously then I get the appeal of moving to taxing the rich. That's low-hanging fruit, but that fruit only has so much juice in it. And as Scott mentioned, we're going up by $12 trillion in debt here in the next decade alone. And there's going to be a lot of competing demands for where that money goes. And so I would like to see some discussion of repurposed existing spending at least as part of the discussion to be more realistic about the trade-offs that occur. And, to Vicki's point about there being unseen costs right now of a lack of a policy, that's true. Although there would certainly be unseen costs going forward of having a policy like this in place if there are considerable intermittent periods of leave or fraud or things like that. So we have to look at both the cost and benefits of the before and after of a policy. So it's a hard question. I think the important part to me is that when you look at just paid parental leave or even just paid family leave, we are not talking about a considerable sum of money. Most of the expense comes from medical leave. And so again, separating out the different types of leave may make it more palatable to pass in the current environment that we find ourselves, both fiscally and politically. And so I don't think the pursuit of the perfect should stymie any sort of progress on the issue at all.
Good point. And yeah, I think it is the medical leave side of things is usually thought of as the most costly. Is that right? I think I'm right on that. Maybe Scott,
it's also the most common. So
yeah, right.
A little bit over half of FMLA uses are for your own serious health issue unrelated to pregnancy. Which I think, when you think about how you put these things together, you end up in a sort of weird situation where if you could take leave to care for a family member for a condition that you couldn't take leave for yourself, or if you can take leave to care for a new child, but you can't take leave because you have preeclampsia or some other condition prior to pregnancy, you end up with some weird situations, whereas a comprehensive policy sort of addresses all of the equities.
Right. One more quick comment though on the medical leave, because I believe Biden is planning on scaling that in towards the tail end of the time period because it is so expensive. And to me, it feels a little bit, it's not a balloon mortgage, but it would be helpful to know if when the policy is fully in place, what does it cost each year? Because that's what we're going to pay going forward. We don't want the policy that millions of families depend on to all of a sudden have sticker shock, at the 11-year mark. And so I get the Washington trickery. That's why I moved to Texas. But it would be nice to have a clearer sense of what the annual costs are and how we plan to pay for them.
Yeah, my guess is that we'll see some of that in the budget that comes out in a few weeks. But yeah, I believe the Biden folks are thinking about phasing in the medical leave, starting it with something so that everybody has access to paid leave for something at the beginning. But perhaps phasing in the number of weeks over time differently for the different purposes.
Great. Yep, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, I think too, the issue of sort of deficits, in my mind strengthens a little bit the case for relying on some other policies that would be less costly, but that would still put a lot of money potentially in the hands of folks who need to take leave. Just thinking of a couple in particular, my colleagues, Matt Weidinger and Catherine Stevens, have a proposal that would let people take essentially a big chunk of the $34,000 per kid that they eventually will get from the child tax credit and use that in the early years. Obviously, that's only of help if you're talking about family leave around a new birth or a young child. Or a proposal like Senator Lee has offered, where you would essentially pay for your leave through having to work a little bit longer before you can draw down your social security benefits. Those would be two examples where, if done right, the cost would actually be zero, but that would do a lot of good at the same time.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was actually a question that came through from the audience as well, about that there have been some bipartisan proposals around paid leave, and Matt and Catherine's proposal is similar to the Cassidy-Sinema proposal. It wasn't allowing so many years to pull forward of the child tax credit, but it was a proposal around pulling forward the child tax credit and using that for leave after the birth of a child. But I guess maybe, Scott, what are your thoughts on just the chances of those kind of proposals gaining more Republican support beyond Senator Lee and Senator Cassidy, which it seems like, and a few more, I should say, but there definitely would need to be a much broader support among Republicans. Do you think there's any chance?
Say. I think, Republicans are not focused especially strongly on policy right now. I think we're all hoping that sort of that the fever breaks related to some of the sort of cultural grievance or whatever that really seems to be the thing animating a lot of people in the party these days. But I think in principle they ought to be. They're very consistent with conservative principles. There's some fear around the Lee proposal. I think that essentially the pay-fors, at the end, that people get to their retirement years and then are told, well, you took your benefits earlier, and so you can't actually retire yet. That it would be too hard to resist calls to actually hold out and require them to work more. That seems a reasonable concern. I don't think it ought to be enough to kill the idea at all. The CTC proposal, seems like it ought to be more appealing to Republicans than most of the conversation that's happening around the child tax credit right now and child allowances. It would do a lot of good for new parents, but it would avoid a lot of the potential costs in the form of unintended consequences or just the budgetary costs that some of the other proposals would entail.
Can I just?
And Abby, it looked like you wanted to jump in. Yeah, Abby.
Yeah, to the point of, obviously the cash and money is helpful, but when you look at the literature on paid leave, it's about the time. It's about the time that, it's specifically most of the literature, that an infant spends with their parents for the neonatal development, for the decreased neonatal fatality, for the woman's healing, for the reentry into the workforce after that child is old enough to go into childcare, if that's the path those parents choose to take. We should make it as easy as possible for parents and infants in particular to have that time together. And that's cash, but it's the job protection point that Vicki made. We don't get these benefits just by, throwing a check at it and saying, like, hopefully they figure out. We get it if there's extended time for families to bond. And we should be making that as easy as possible, which means not trading out other benefits that person would get later in life. Ideally, I think we'd be a better off society if as many parents as possible could spend those first few weeks and months with their own child, that sets the stage for, their work and caregiving life to come. And so I think for me, the focus of the conversation should be, how do we make this as easy as possible, given the benefits we know that come from it, instead of making it as hard as possible to access.
Great. Yes, thank you for reminding us of that. And that's a great perspective. And Vicki, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to make a very similar point to Abby, but also just to say similarly, the whole point of paid leave is that somebody has a job, they take leave from their job, and they come back to that job. they continue to contribute to their workplace. Their employer doesn't need to look for a permanent replacement. And that's how both the cost savings and the value come in. And so it is true that you could come up with other cash benefits or other supports at different times for a circumstance other than a birth of a child. But I also think that if we think about this not as a safety net, not as just income support, but really as a workforce retention policy and an earned benefit that you get from work and going back to work, it puts it in a different light, and I think helps to create a foundation for understanding why you would want a comprehensive policy. And we can, nibble over durations or things like that if we need to. But I think, part of the reason why the international comparisons are difficult, like Abby was saying, is that we don't have anything that the rest of the world has. And so other countries did develop these policies at different times. We now have an opportunity to make good on our failings up to this point and to do something in each of these areas.
Thank you. So we are out of time. So I just want to thank our three panelists. As always, you three give me a great deal to think about, and I think I know a lot coming in, and then I learned so much more from all of you. So thank you for your perspectives and your insights. Really appreciate your time, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Take care.